put up on screen the slides. Recording has started. Thank you, Pete. Thanks, Ollie, who's supporting us in the background. Good morning. I will, before I go any further, I will put up on screen the slides that I prepared earlier. That would be useful. And start with a little introduction. So I'm based just outside Cardiff in South Wales. I work mostly in Wales and mostly with public services. And what I do is I'm an independent consultant and facilitator. So I take teams on a journey through engagement into co-production, meaningful involvement, and shared decision making. And which means that along the way, we also look at developing good collaboration, good partnerships, because a lot of the values and the principles of working are common across these ways of working. It's about how do we build great working relationships and trusted relationships to work together to change things. So yes, this is me. And today we're going to cover a few things. We're going to think about not just the work we're doing when we take a strengths-based approach, but the way we're doing it and the context that we're doing it in. So we're going to start by talking about power because it's the topic for today. Then we're going to talk about co-production a bit, and then we're going to weave those two things together and think about, well, what does it look like when we really apply our thinking about power in a co-production context? So please keep using the chat, put in any thoughts, comments, questions as they occur to you. I'll structure this this next hour so that I share a little bit and then we kind of pop into the chat and have a bit of a discussion. I pick up some of the things that you've been flagging, any questions you've been raising, then I'll talk a little bit more about something else and then dip into the chat again. So please do keep posting things as they come along, and I've seen people have been kind of responding to one another and chatting in there, so please do keep that going. Just so you know, for the benefit of the recording and anybody watching this after the fact, when I pick something up in chat, I will do my utmost to remember to read out what it is I'm picking up in chat so that so people listening back later can see it. I'm nearly saying that as a note to self. Now I've said it out loud, I'll probably remember. So where do we start? Well, let's start with talking about power, and the kind of my starting point really is thinking about a definition, and really power is the capacity to impact and influence our environment. In itself, power is neutral. It's a potential. But the thing that's important to think about is the different types of power that we might be exercising. Just checking if you've got little grey bars over the slides. Can everybody see the slides okay? Is that all right? Okay, fabulous. So I've picked up some definitions of power from the BRAP anti-racism course that I was on a few years ago, and thinking about things like social power, for example, which is around the things that tend to be valued in mainstream society. So social power sort of derives from wealth, class, education, age, health, physical appearance, that sort of thing. So it's like, what does society or mainstream society say matters? Expert power is more around the skills and knowledge that you have, your level of information and understanding. So this could be whatever you have an expertise or really good knowledge about. Positional power is about your position in a particular role, a formal role within a structure. So for example, a chief executive will have a lot of positional power, especially relative to like frontline workers in the same organization. Personal power is to do with our abilities, our psychological, social, relational abilities. So how we get on with people, how we get on in life, those things that we bring and that make us us. And contextual power is based on our ability to align with the norms of the group. And often they're unsaid norms. And so it's like how a group operates, can we fit into that? And can we sort of like follow the pattern so that we're well accepted and we weren't seen? So it can be linked to like popularity within a particular group or that kind of thing. There's a little bit of overlap and there are synergies between these sort of aspects of power, and sometimes kind of like there's different definitions and different ways of sort of like categorizing it. And I'm sure lots of academic papers are written about it and lots of different models. But the important thing to remember, even this is just one way of looking at it, but power is relative, is the point I'm trying to make. So power in itself is neutral by definition, in the definition, but in terms of the power we have, the power that I have, that's relative depending on which context I'm in, who I'm around, what I'm doing, what I'm bringing to the table. And so it's very dependent on the situation and the context and the surroundings. And so there is a thing called power literacy, which is our understanding of our own power and privilege in the situation. And you could make the analogy of this is about seeing the water that we swim in. And often the more power we have, the less aware we are, consciously aware we are of it. And so power literacy is really about bringing that attention to what the situation is and what relative power we might have compared to other people. Now, this is important because if we're not, especially if we're in a position of power, if we're not aware of the power and the privilege that we have, or the power we can exercise, we can accidentally exclude people. We can sometimes deliberately exclude people. Some of the time it's more accidental and unconscious. It's just because we're just not aware of it. But whether it's deliberate or whether it's accidental, it's not okay. But the only way to really think about inclusion, really think about rebalancing power is to be aware, to start with ourselves and to be aware of the power that we bring. I was researching lots of like different books about power and writings about power, and um, uh, there was one quote that stood out to me, which is like, power looks very different to the people who don't have as much or who don't have any. And that's really what we're looking to address. If we want to work in a strengths-based way, in a relationship-centered way, then we have to bring that self-awareness of what we're bringing to the table in order to build the relationships, but also to create inclusive spaces and bring other people's voices in. Because if we're not aware of how we're showing up and how much space we're taking up or how much airtime we're taking up, then we're not making conscious decisions about including people, about raising other voices, about really hearing other people and hearing their strengths and valuing what they're bringing. So power literacy, super important. And I just wanted to share two tools which might be of interest and might be useful. The first one is the Wheel of Power and Privilege that's been developed by Sylvia Duckworth. And this one is about looking at the intersection of power, privilege, and our social identities. So Sylvia Duckworth has identified 12 sort of categories of social identities, which include things like, you know, citizenship. Are you a citizen of this country or not? What's your housing situation? What's your neurodiversity status? A number of different dimensions. And she developed that really with kind of a thinking around intersectionality and how those interact. And so this wheel of power stroke privilege is how to explain it, is near the center, in more power. And the more you go out to the outside, the more you're likely to be excluded and marginalized in that dimension. And the more dimensions you have where we're kind of sitting towards the margins, the more probably discrimination and challenges and constraints you'll be experiencing. And the closer you are to that central kind of power circle, the more, again, power, capacity to act, capacity to influence, agency you're going to have in the context of sort of like societal and systemic ways of operating. So this is an interesting exercise to do on an individual level. So you can take this disc, this wheel, and kind of color in the different sections and figure out where you sit and how big or how small your your area is, and the smaller, the closer to the core it is, the more power you have, and the wider it is, the more you'll be operating on the margins in some dimensions. Sort of similar to that, but slightly different. I also wanted to show you the positionality wheel, which is developed by Leslie Ann Knoll. And this has similarities to this color wheel I just showed you before, the wheel of power and privilege. This is work developed in social research. So Leslie Ann Knoll encourages her students and her partners in her research teams to develop what she calls reflexivity statements. Reflex as in from reflection. So it's like thinking about what our position is. So you can do this as an individual, just for you personally, just like the wheel we've just looked at. But this is really interesting to do as a team. And so the reason this is important is because your background frames how you conduct research if you're a social researcher, but your background frames how you think about your work, about your activities, about what you're bringing. So you can be bringing some strengths because you'll have knowledge about ways of living or characteristics that you have insider knowledge from your own lived experience. But there's also some weaknesses in that you might make assumptions about the others. And so none of those dimensions are good or bad. It's just saying be very aware of the ones that you know well and the ones that maybe you're making assumptions for and you need to check your thinking. And so there are things like, what languages do I speak? And what was my, was my family well-to-do or not when I was a child? How about now? How am I doing? And then am I married? Am I a parent? What's my level of education? What's my job? Those sorts of things. And that's a nice one to do as a team. And I just wanted to pop up an example. And I apologize, it's super blurry because it's a screenshot of what was quite a small illustration. But I just wanted to give you the idea of this was done on a digital whiteboard. And so this whole research team put little post-its. So every person put at least one post-it on each of the categories. And so as a team, they could see for each dimension what were the different views they brought and what were the different experience they brought. And so they could map together what are the things that they have insight into and what are maybe the gaps, or what are the things that they need to find out more, and what are the strengths and what are the potential gaps and weaknesses. So that's a nice tool. There's different ways to complete this, but I thought this was a nice way to think about it. So before I move on, actually, I might stop sharing for a second so we can see each other a bit more. Hello, hi back. I was wondering if we could take a moment and maybe pop in the chat some thoughts or some reflections on what we've been talking about, and just a few moments of reflection, because I've just done a lot of talking. And I was wondering if I could pose a question in the chat, which is, if I can paste it properly. There we are. Nope, that's not what I wanted to paste. Bear with me. My question is, how can power be good, as in constructive, generative, and how can power be bad, as in destructive and damaging? And I really invite your reflection based on your experience, as much or as little as you're comfortable sharing, obviously, but in situations you've seen, or in organizations or dynamics you've been either witness to or have experienced, are there times that you can think of where power has been useful? Whether it's in you, whether it's in somebody else, what have you seen? And in what times has power been damaging or harmful? If you'd like to pop in the chat, that would be great. But actually, we've got a couple of minutes, and if somebody, I was just going to say that. Thanks, Ollie. If somebody would like to contribute verbally, just put your hand up and we can do that as well. Ollie, let's start with you. Thanks for starting us on the conversation. Oh no, Ollie, your speakers don't work. Can't hear you. All right, Ollie's going to type in the chat as well. Thanks, Ollie. Would anybody fancy speaking? Or is everybody like busy typing away? I think lots of people are typing away. I can see very concentrated faces. Thanks.
Copy.
Oh, Mike. over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of a couple different instances in sort of corporate life. I mean, I'm from America, so there was obviously the corporate culture all over. But anyway, I've seen people who are very good managers who use their power within the workplace setting to make sure that their employees are treated fairly, that people are respected, heard, listened to, and I mean, I love it when you see someone who has the power stepping on someone who's kind of a jerk,
Yes.
who's been abusing someone else or demeaning or belittling someone, and they just kind of get served for it. But then and then the other side, I've seen the people who aren't very nice, who have the power, who do the belittling, do the um, not listening, and stifling someone's voice. So I guess I've seen both that way, and that's just kind of the first thing that popped in my head.
For sure. No, thanks so much. And thanks for getting us started. It reflects a couple of things that I'm seeing coming through the chat as well in terms of how it can be constructive and generative when it's, in service of a greater goal or supporting somebody else, but actually can be destructive and really challenging. Ooh, lots of things coming through the chat. I will hand over to Eve for the moment and then pick up some chat comments.
I think I was thinking my initial thought was about collective power and how that can be constructive and generative, but also the other way. So it can be positive when I think sort of the collective power is used to almost be greater than the sum of its parts. So the individuals coming together and working to create forms of power that can influence and lift people up. But then the flip side of that is that when there's an ulterior agenda, how the collective can sort of squash can squash people who already don't have a lot of power.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you. I love that dimension of thinking about power as a collective, because it's not always just our personal power, but it's when we're part of a group, what happens and how do those things interact. Before I come over to Peter, I'll just pick up a couple of things from the chat. A mention of good use of power in crisis management. Sometimes you need strong leadership, and that owning that position of power and being able to make decisions quickly for that collective good, it can be the best solution in that moment, the needed solution, but also thinking about when is that right, and when actually is the collective voice needed to be brought to the fore, and kind of thinking about, oh yeah, using power to remove decision making from people, or kind of delegating it to just people with the power who then have to make decisions on behalf of everybody else, and actually are they the best placed to exercise that power and to make decisions for everybody else. So yes, I will pick up a few more things in a second, keep them coming, but I'll hand over to Peter for now. Pete.
Yeah, I think I'm probably just going to repeat what you just said, but for me, in kind of in leadership position, there is a tension between creating that collaborative approach where you're hearing everybody's voices and truly listening, and then also taking charge and getting things done, because ultimately that's what we're probably all being paid to do. And so that's sometimes I find that challenging of at what point do I take charge? Because otherwise you can go around in circles and loops
Yeah.
quite readily, can't you?
Yes, absolutely. That's a very good point. I know when I'm in a position of leadership, I tend to be more like very collective focused and saying, no, no, we'll just decide everything together, and really struggle to step into that role. It was like, no, I just need to make a call, and people are looking to me to actually do it, and kind of reading that room and finding the line where it's like, no, this is when I need to step up, and this is when we need to hear everybody. It's just part of our inner work, I guess, of self-awareness and self-understanding. I wanted to complete that with a thought from Catherine in the chat, that actually how it can be used for good, between inverted commas, by someone who genuinely believes like they're doing the best thing and that they understand. But if they don't have that self-awareness, if they don't realize what their blinkers are, or like their blind spots or their limitations are, they might be sort of like maybe consciously, probably unconsciously applying power in a way that actually excludes and disables others. Even though the intentions are good, actually the effect is bad, for want of a better word, because of that lack of awareness and power literacy. There are loads of excellent points in the chat. I cannot read through all of them because otherwise I'll talk about only this, and I need to move on to talking about co-production in a second. But thank you so much for your contributions, and please, keep picking them up and kind of like chatting to each other in that. But without further ado, I will talk a little bit about co-production before we bring both of these themes together. So here's the slide I made earlier. I thought I would start again, like I did a bit with with power. I'd start again with a definition, just so that we're all talking about the same thing. And co-production is really, it exists at the intersection, or sort of it's the interaction between people, by who I mean kind of citizen service users, people who are not in a professional role, and professionals, people who work in public services, people who work in government. Footnote: this definition of co-production applies to co-production in public services, because co-production exists in the media, co-production exists in retail, and they have very different definitions. So we're very much talking about where we're in organizations supporting people, whether it's statutory, government, third sector. For co-production to happen, people and professionals need to be working together in equal and reciprocal ways. There's got to be shared power, shared decision making. And what co-production isn't is either citizens, people, communities working together and achieving their own aims, which is super important and very essential to community life. But it's not co-production, it's community organizing and community action. And co-production is also not organizations working with other organizations or teams working across teams. That's collaboration, but if the voice of citizen or service user isn't part of that, it's not co-production. Now, all of these three things are important and have their place. I just like to be precise with the definition of co-production. Co-production really only happens if there is an interaction and dialogue and shared decision and action between the people who deliver or design services and the people who use and access services, and actually that the decision making is joint. You could think about it as, those phrases, nothing about me without me, as a citizen service user. And also, if you're not at the table, then you're probably on the menu. So that's what co-production is trying to avoid, is if we're going to make decisions about people's lives, then they need to be part of that decision making. When we take a strengths-based approach, it's about leveraging, really drawing on everybody's strengths, which might be different. So it's not saying, okay, if we're doing co-production and people and professionals are working together, we're splitting it 50-50 down the middle, everybody does the same thing. It's really about saying, well, who brings what and what is the value that this brings to the decision making? So professionals can bring, the resources of a system or the structures and enabling of a system possibly, and their professional experience and training, and service users and citizens bring lived experience or living experience and perspectives of different areas of knowledge that professionals can't have. And so the sum or the combination of these different ways, different lenses of the world end up creating better decisions and better solutions because of having more input and more data. If you're wondering whether something is co-production or not, this is the spectrum that I use to think about, are we doing with people? Are we doing to people? Are we doing for people? It's linked to the ladders of participation, ladders of engagement that you might have seen. It's flipped on its side and taken as more of a spectrum, because what I like to say about it is, like, doing to or doing for aren't bad in themselves and they have their place. But the encouragement to go more towards doing with, because organizations, especially I work with a lot of professionals and teams, and doing to and doing for is a very system driven, organizational driven approach. Is like, it's easy to manage, it's easy to plan, and then we'll make a plan and we'll roll it out, and it's easy to like keep tabs on. Whereas doing with people can go off in unexpected directions, and it feels messy when we start and we don't know where it's going, and it feels risky as a traditional organization. And so my encouragement to professionals was, what can you move towards the doing with conversation? without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Sometimes doing 2 or doing 4 are absolutely the right response, but it's about finding the right measured response for what the situation is. So if we're doing 2 people, there might be things like if there's a risk to life or to somebody's safety, you know, it might be for protection. It might be, you know, in a coercive environment, because think about the criminal justice system. It's like somebody needs protecting from somebody else. And so professionals need to step in at that point. And I'm not going to open the debate. We don't have time for kind of the values and issues with the current criminal justice system, but think about kind of like the thinking behind the approach is at some point we have to step in to secure, to safeguard. And in the education and persuasion section is thinking, if you think about smoking cessation programs, is saying we as government people who work on public health campaigns, we know that everybody should stop smoking, and we have the data and we know what the right solution is. So we just need to find a way to get people to do what we think is right and stop smoking. So it's very much we just need to find the right message to get it across. That's kind of doing 2. Doing 4 has got things like information, you know, where do we, what information do people want to know? How do we share it? Where do we share it so that it's in the right format and accessible to them? Consultations, that often get a very bad rap, often because they're not done in the right place at the right time, but consultation done well for the right reasons can actually give you a lot of data and a lot of insight on what's happening if you know what questions you want to ask and what answers you're looking for, what data you're looking for. And participation events like, you know, drop-in events, focus groups can bring you quite a lot of data as an organization if you're not quite sure what questions you want to ask and you want to have an exploratory conversation with people. But whether it's information, consultation, or participation, as an organization, as a professional, I know what I want to find out. I know what questions I want to ask. I know what area I want to work on. I just need some input to fine-tune my decisions. But then I'll make the decision. I'll take all this data away and I'll make a decision, and I'll probably enact it as well. So the decision making and the power to act stays with me. I will listen. And I can listen very well, but ultimately I'm the one who's responsible and who has the power to act. Whereas if we move into that last section, the doing with, as you'd expect, with co-production, with citizen involvement, these are the situations where we make the decisions together. So not only do we value the knowledge and information from everybody who's involved, we do listen, but we listen in both directions. Between, you know, professional and citizens, but also we take decisions together, and more than likely we'll all have a role in actioning these decisions. So when we ask, you know, who's holding the power, whose agenda is it, that's the clue that's going to tell us, is this co-production or not? And again, you know, what kind of power are we exerting, and are we sharing, as organizations, are we sharing power? As citizens and service users, are we allowed, are we enabled to grasp the power and actually have a voice and be a part of these decisions and conversations? So what matters? Does people knowledge matter? Who makes the decisions? Who make the actions? I just wanted to add a little footnote I forgot to say in the doing 2 section. One of my favorite examples, if somebody's had a heart attack and they're unconscious and the paramedics are on the scene, you know, it's absolutely the right thing to do to the patient at that point, because they're not even in a position to share knowledge about their life or what's going on. It's like you have to do what you have to do to save a life. And likewise, sometimes doing 4 is the right approach, and you have to listen really carefully, but then make maybe a national policy decision that's going to have to apply to everybody. So you get as informed and as much insight as you can, but ultimately somebody somewhere is going to have to write and publish this policy. So there are places where they're the right approaches and the useful approaches, but my nudge to organizations and teams is about where are the places where we can do with, when we can change the conversation, actually share the power. That was a very, very nutshell explanation of the really core co-production principles. How is that landing? Let me stop sharing a second, and can I just check in with you? Does this make sense? Is everybody like, yep, we know what this is, totally comfortable with it? Double thumbs up. Thanks, Nick. Any questions? Any questions where you're like, maybe like, what if this? Or how about when this happens? You know, how are you thinking about co-production? Do you have sort of like doubts, questions, uncertainties? I'm just popping in a message in the chat. Do you have any, yes, but what if? Or how about this? And while you're thinking about it, let's have a little conversation about co-production. But I just picked up a post in the chat, which is from Gemma. On a personal level, the shift in mindset from someone who has a background of doing to doing with is huge, and absolutely is kind of like a real different way of thinking. It takes self-awareness, you're absolutely right, of our own behaviors and experiences to shift the mindset. And those tools around power, you know, what are we bringing? What is our experience? What do we know? But also what do we not know is part of that awareness, isn't it? But reflective spaces to think and talk about this stuff in a constructive way are also useful. And in an extra note in the chat that like sometimes people ask about co-production and they talk about co-production and they don't quite understand what it means. That is true. And these little models that I shared, I'm kind of like talking about them all the time. It's like co-production is this. You might know this already, but let's just recap so we're all on the same page. And sometimes there's a real light bulb moment at that moment. Nick, you've got your hand up. Would you like to come in? Over to you.
Yeah, I just me myself. I mean, I've been working with co-production for I don't know, it's nearly a decade now. From when I was with what they call it doesn't matter who was with when I first saw the light, shall we say, and with myself and where I'm at now within stages of how I'm thinking. I need things to change within governmental or structural way that we live. It's like say we get so far down the line with a project,
Yeah,
and then we have co-production, and we have co-production from an expert knowledge, and the knowledge that comes out of their mouth absolutely throws everything out. It throws all the backwater out that we've just built up over that period of time before we brought the expert knowledge in that gave that. Because it's like, what do we do there? Do we just like scrap the whole lot and start from again, like 5 years work, 4 years work, or what do we do?
What do you do? It's tough, isn't it?
Or
The
other way is like,
yeah.
we try and meld that into what we're doing, which it is co-production, obviously, but I'm on about two ends of a spectrum here. Specifically, I'm thinking about a race point of view that is never going to shift from the other end of the scale that I'm talking about. Those things are never going to shift. And it's like, can you see there where it's like, how do we get over this?
I'm going to give you a response that's very general and kind of abstract, because without going into like what exactly happened, who did what, what are the stages, who are the actors and all that, which I'm more than happy to have a catch up at another point and really delve in. But I think in general terms, it's about what are the relationships and what are the dialogues that are happening. And so this person who's just come in, or this actor who's just come in and derail things, it's like, why weren't they in this conversation before? Why weren't they in the relationship before? Not because it's like, oh, it's too late now, it's crying over spilled milk, but it's understanding the dynamics. And so what are the pressures and what are the perspectives that they're bringing? And if it's, I'm making an assumption here, but if it's an organization or a commissioner or somebody from quite a structural, systemic structure, there could be a lot around what pressures are they under, who's telling them to do what, that they have to kind of comply. Is there compliance? Is there risk aversion? If they haven't been in the conversation from the start, they just not understand like the relationship they have built and the trust that's been built. And so the question is like, how can they see it? So they'll feel in the very entrenched solution saying, you absolutely must do this, otherwise it's not safe and we can't progress. And actually it's like, well, how can we unstick this conversation to really understand what's the fear really behind their position, and what's stopping them from having openness, and trying to show that maybe this could coexist with what's already happened as well,
Okay.
finding that common ground. So
Right.
you probably never shift from like one completely accepting the other or this, but it's like, where can we find
It's
that
like a
common
melding.
understanding? Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that.
No problems. I think one thing that always gives me hope, also is also super frustrating, but both at the same time, is that when we work with, organizations or teams or whatever, we're working with people. So we might be working with an organization, but really we're working with that person from the organization, and they're bringing their own baggage and their own fears and their own past experience. And maybe they've been in horrible jobs before, or maybe in a horrible job now that they hate. And, so what are they bringing that's sort of like under the waterline? So we, in the iceberg, we see like what they're saying explicitly, and you can do this or you can't do that, or I just can't sign this off. But under the waterline, there's a bunch of stuff that's going on for them, internal to the organization, internal to them personally. And actually, if we can build the relationships and seek to understand them, that brings the waterline down a bit and brings more things into sort of like conscious, explicit dialogue, and going, okay, well, how can we meet your needs as well as meeting ours? And how can we show you the value of what's been done so far, as well as understanding like what limitations you're bringing? Is more and more dialogue. I could talk about this for an hour, but thank you, Nick. It's a really great question, because this co-production work, I showed it in 2 slides. It's like, yeah, neat little model, done. And actually, once you start applying it, it's just like this. It's just relationship building. It's day to day. Everything's changing constantly, and we just have to feel our way through. And in a way, bring a lot of compassion to the work that we're doing, both to the others who are involved, also to ourselves, because this work is hard, and sometimes it can't be done in that moment. And so we've got to sometimes step away gracefully to be able to come back to it. And so that self-care and the self-awareness are as important as the awareness and the compassion we bring to the other people who are involved. Thank you, Nick. That was a really great question, and some responses to that in the chat. Can we use the input that's through it on one open to learn how do we shift things in the future? Even if at that point we can't shift it, if that doesn't work, but actually what can we learn that might be able to apply later on? Hal, would you like to come in?
Yeah, sorry, just it's quite a big question, but for example, my local NHS trusts have had since the 1980s objectives about co-production.
Yeah.
And we've got patient participation groups, we've got all sorts of stuff. But the bottom line, and maybe this is my bias, is that people with power don't really want to give that power up. What is it that needs to fundamentally change to make all of these institutions and bodies actually really embrace co-production in its true form, rather than being very tokenistic?
You're right, it's a huge question. If I had a magic wand, the things that I would like to change would be on an individual level, the people involved need to really get co-production in here. Not even, let alone the misunderstanding of we think we know what co-production is, but actually we don't. But even if we have a really decent intellectual understanding of it, it doesn't compare to like how you experience it. If you've been in a co-production process, if you've been in true co-production conversation, it changes you. And that's something that can only happen once you've experienced it. And so having the opportunity for everybody to see, the power in those conversations and how things shift when we're in relational interactions and all of that, that's my first wish, would be just experience it, to see like the power and magic that happens there. And I don't use the word magic lightly, because that's something that can only be, can really only be experienced. You can read all the case studies you want, but until you've seen it personally firsthand, you're just like, oh, I get it. So that's a thing that needs to happen. So I don't know, the solution is maybe, just lots more little prototypes, lots more practice. I guess one of the solutions for that is like creating the opportunities for people to experience co-production. And for that, my second wish on my magic wand is fearless leadership, because it's hard when you manage an organization and you have like 17 million other pressures to go, oh yes, and also we're going to create space and time and a bit of money, a bit of resource so that people can try things and learn. You know, we can be a learning organization. We'll prototype stuff, we'll learn from doing, but also at the same time, we're within a system where, you know, we're very key performance indicator driven. We have to report to funders, we have to report to commissioners, we have to report to, you know, we're under pressure from lots of people who the system isn't shaped for us to be all like wiggly and timey-wimey and trying things as we go along. The system is very rigorous and puts us in boxes, but within that we need to try and make things soft and emergent. So leaders need to create the space for their teams to be able to do that. And so you need some kind of like fearless and bit enlightened leadership that can enable it. And my third wish on the magic wand is, in order for the leaders to have the space to do that, we also need like the policy or the legislative context to do it. I don't know where you're based, Paul. In Wales, and I don't want to be like, oh, in Wales we can brag about it, but in Wales we have an amazing opportunity because we have legislation that says, for example, in health and social care, you should be co-producing. And so it opens the conversation. It doesn't mean everybody's doing it yet. It doesn't mean people even understand co-production everywhere yet, but that means it's starting a conversation, and there are leaders who are going, oh, we also have a statutory duty to think about co-production. What do we need to know? And that opens the door. So I think there is some top-down direction needed, or some permission and some enabling needed, as well as some sort of like ground up, you know, everybody's personal experience. And if you can make changes yourself, then that will have a ripple effect, and that will affect other people, and they will see what's happening and go, oh, maybe I'm thinking about that differently. And that in itself is something, because that will have a ripple effect. Yes, does that answer your question? Thank you. Now, if I were God, that's what I would do. But in the meantime, I'll keep just talking about co-production and the good that you can do. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for the comments in the chat. I've got to kind of pull these two strands together about power and co-production. So what does it look like in practice? Here's my slides back. I'll remove all these little boxes that are probably floating around on your screen. Why is that not disappearing? Hang on. My little black box isn't going away. I think this should work.
It's not on our screen, Noreen.
Oh, that's great. I was worried you had like grey bits sort of polluting your visual. Okay, great. So I have waxed a bit lyrical about what might be possible, but on a day-to-day level, you know, what can we do tomorrow? What can we do next week? I want to bring us back to the values of co-production, and the 5 values that we use at the Co-Production Network for Wales are: we value all participants and we build on their strengths. We develop networks across silos. We work across these boundaries. We do what matters for all the people involved in the co-production. We build relationships. We build trust. We share power. And for people to be change makers, organizations become enablers, create the conditions. And I want to unpack each one of those. Co-production, as you know, isn't sort of like a 12-item tick list to be like, if you do all these things, you'll have nailed co-production and you can move to the next thing. Co-production is really a way of thinking, and who said earlier, you know, it's a real mindset shift. It's like, how do we shift from doing things in a sort of linear kind of let's plan it first and then let's just roll it out way, to, you know, an emergent way, and really listening to all the voices that are coming up. So if we're going to take this approach and we keep checking in with these values, then actually what does it look like in practice? And so if we're going to value everybody who's involved, then we need to enable them to, you know, we need to think about accessibility. Not everybody is able to show up in the same way, you know, because we have different power, we have different relationships to the organization, to the space that we're convening to. Not everybody, people might need adaptations or translation or BSL interpretation, or making sure the spaces are whatever they need to be for them to be comfortable and accessible and inclusive. So we need to think about that. Can people show up And I talk about, we talk about equity, not equality. This is like, some people might need more adaptations or more support to be able to show up and have parity of voice. So how do we ensure that? And also, how do we make sure that people feel safe, they feel valued, they feel heard, they feel understood? Now, I know I have a bit of a problem with and many people have with the kind of like, let's make a safe space expression, because it's not up to us to decide if the space is safe for people, that is up to the people coming to say if that feels safe for them. But if we can have that conversation, like, what do people need? Can they speak without the fear that, if they say something, if they challenge, there won't be any consequences. They won't lose support, or they won't be ignored, or that actually it's possible for them to have the same amount of voice as other people who have maybe more positional power, and be treated in the same way, so that actually that equality is real in the room. If we think about developing networks across silos and across traditional boundaries, traditional hierarchies, we want to pay attention to people who may be outside of traditional organizational systems. What wisdom do they bring? What insight do they bring? If we keep talking to the same people, we'll only find out what this our bubble knows. I had a really lovely and insightful testimonial and feedback after a recovery college course. And one of the professionals who'd been on the course said, "Oh my God, when you train mental health professionals, they learn from other professionals. Their trainers are people who work in mental health. And so all they find out is what other professionals think." And then the recovery college course was this opportunity to hear what everybody else thinks, people accessing services, their families, their carers, all these different variations and angles on the service. And it was such a light bulb moment. And that moment of like, when you're trained by a professional, you only hear what professionals think. It really stuck with me. It's like, we need to pay attention to and learn from all these different perspectives and voices. In terms of doing what matters for people involved, well, we need to listen to understand before we come in. We roll out our strategic priorities and our agenda and our questions and the stuff we want to find out as professionals and organizations, which is a very human and natural tendency, because we are often working on a program, or we're working on we've been commissioned to do something, or we've been, sent off to find out this information or solve this problem. And so we come in going like, oh, okay, I have to solve this problem. So what can you tell me about the problem? But if we put that on pause a second and we start a different conversation going, what's it like being you? What is your life like? Where do you live and how do you live and what works and what doesn't work? Half the time you'll start finding answers to the question you're bringing anyway, but also it's putting a different dynamic in the relationship. Is saying, I'm here to listen to you and understand you. I'm not here to just bring my agenda and then go away again. But it's like, how do we build a relationship? How do we get to know one another? And how do we get to find out what works and what doesn't work together? These little points of action, by the way, they're just starting points, they're ideas, but I wanted to give you a sense of what it might look like in practice, what the action might be. In terms of building relationships of trust, sharing power, we need the spaces to kind of work together, to give and take constructive feedback. Trust enables communication. And the way to get people to trust this is to be trustworthy. Organizations and professionals would go, oh, well, I don't understand why this community doesn't trust me. It's like, well, have you done anything that in the way that you show up that leads them to trust you yet or not? And so when you have trust, then you can have that communication that feels safer. You can kind of criticize constructively. You can have humility as a professional and say, oh, well, I don't know. Let's figure it out together. You need to create the relationship to have the conditions to do that. And finally, in terms of people can make change and organizations need to enable that, create the conditions for that to happen, is that good use of power. Positional power enables us as organizations, as professionals, to remove barriers, to change the rules, to change the permissions. A citizen would like to have more voice, but they can't change the system. But a professional might be able to change the system and say, you want voice? We have space for that voice, because I can kind of protect that space on your behalf. And so that's the the positive, the constructive use of power, where in co-production, where it's about sharing power, but also using the power you have, owning the power to create the conditions where voices can be heard. I want to add a couple of thoughts. Oh, I'm nearly at time. Ollie, I'm going to go over a tiny bit. I hope that's okay. Thanks, Ollie. I wanted to share this photo. It's from 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. And years after that, I spoke to somebody who'd been a facilitator, community builder, somebody who'd gone to work in the affected communities. And we were on this like international kind of facilitators call, and they said something that just stayed with me, like it'll never leave me. He said, the people I was working with, they'd lost their houses, they'd lost everything they owned, they just had the clothes that they were there in, and some of them didn't even know if their families were safe. And I'd been flown in from a different state, and I was staying in a hotel, and I have a suitcase full of my stuff, and my family was safe at home. And there was nothing I could do about that. This really stark inequality between me in my role and the people I was here to support. I couldn't undo that. Not in that moment. We can talk about kind of changing the system and kind of wider change, international, global, systemic change. But in that moment, I couldn't do anything about it. But I had to work within it. I had to work with it. And the only thing you can do in those circumstances is just have that deep awareness and that deep compassion for the situation. And just that needs to color every decision and every action that you bring. So just bring that awareness. You must hold it in your awareness. However, sometimes you might have more power to change things than you think. So we don't always work in such stark, really contrast situations. A lot of the time we're working in, dare I say, business as usual public services, even though business is very much not as usual at the moment, and there's all sorts of pressures and crises all over the place. But there are a lot of places where we can influence and we can make change. And so I want to share this little pyramid of co-production, and it's a pyramid to kind of like reflect numbers. So if you're going to embark on a co-production journey, say as a team or as an organization, I would recommend that you start in like the bottom layer of the pyramid, which is everybody that you support as an organization. Who are all your clients, stroke service users, stroke, people you support? You'd want to bring a co-production lens to meeting their individual priorities. So having person-centered conversations. What does a good life look like? What are your aspirations? How can we kind of meet them together? That's individual level co-production. And you want to start there if you're starting that relationship with that person and that interaction. And yeah, especially if people, we've had 70, 80, 90 years of a welfare system that says, no, don't touch it, we'll do it for you. And so if you want to change those dynamics, that changes with individual conversations about like, we don't have all the answers as professionals. You know your life better than anybody else does. What can we figure out together? That's the individual level co-production. Once people are on that journey and their lives are changing and they're settling into that sort of relationship with the organization, it's possible to have a conversation around, would you be interested in kind of maybe shaping a service or contributing to the community or doing something that benefits not just you, but people like you? And this segment is a bit smaller because the numbers one, not everybody will be interested, and that's fine. But some people that you've been building that relationship with will be up for taking the next step with you and going, yeah, all right, I have some ideas. And I know that now you've been listening to me for a while. I trust you to listen to my ideas. So what can we do together? And once you've been on that journey of like, what can we shape together, that group co-production level, there's an invitation possible for like, we would really like to see your views at strategic level. Come and join the board, or would you like to be in this steering group, or come and influence the strategic decisions that we make as an organization. They'll probably affect you, but they will affect a lot of other people besides. And we're looking at, decisions for the next 1, 5, 10, 20 years. So are you up for that? You can't jump straight to that strategic level co-production from a standing start. you need the relationship to develop. You need the trust on both sides to develop. You need the commitment on both sides to develop. And you need people to find their voice, to understand how things work, and to trust that ideas are listened to and heard. But you can go on that journey together and introduce co-production at every level of an organization or a system. And if you happen to be a chief executive or be a leadership team somewhere or work in a position of strong positional power, you might feel very far from those frontline conversations about what does a good life look like for you? What does tomorrow look like? But you're in a position where you can enable those conversations to happen at group co-production level, at individual co-production level. So decision makers, policy makers, people are very strategic level, they can increase the capacity of the system and enable at scale co-production to happen. So wherever you are, wherever you work, and maybe you work at several of these levels, whatever co-production you do today, tomorrow, next week, that will have an impact on the rest of the system. And so in that moment, you may or may not feel that you have the power to change the conversation, the power to change the power dynamics in that conversation. But actually, by bringing a co-production lens, you're having those ripple effects we were talking about earlier, that will have an impact on more of the system and wider and wider and wider. So yeah, influencing that collective shift. I'm quickly looking at my notes to be like, have I forgotten anything? I think that's everything. So my recommendation is, my last word I'm going to leave you with is, don't wait until conditions are perfect. You know, do what you can. Start with where you are. Do what's within your power to do. Change the conversation. And just keep learning, keep taking on that feedback and keep learning and growing, you know, that self-awareness, that reflection process. And yeah, maybe if I can scrounge a couple of minutes more, if you'd like to pop something in the chat, the invitation in the chat is there a place where you could change the conversation, or you could have just a slightly different conversation, whether it's tomorrow, next week, next month, but where can you shift that relationship, shift that power? Is there anywhere in your work, in your activities, in your involvement that you think, oh, maybe I could try this? I would love to hear it. Reflective, just checking Ollie's comment. Happy to eat into the reflective space time to make more space for you and for Q&A. I will wrap up very shortly, and let's see what people want to do, whether they want to Q&A or break, and I'm sticking around for the reflective space, actually. So if people want to break and want to come back after having thought about questions, that's also fine. But while you're thinking about my question, which I maybe pop into the chat, what's one place where you could change the conversation? And maybe if you're a professional, could you do with, instead of doing 4, doing 2? Where's the opportunity? I'm just going to leave you on half a slide of resources that you'll have. We'll circulate the slides after the event. So links to the co-production networks in the 4 nations in the UK, really lovely relationships project, which looks at, you know, all ways of relational practice, permissions, power, developing ways of working, and practice further. I've included the field guide to power literacy. So if you want to dive into kind of more reflective practices, toolkits around power that you can do individually, that you can do as a team, that's really, really nice. And I put in This Is Water, the commencement address by David Foster Wallace, because I think it's such a lovely piece. And it's about bringing our awareness to our everyday life and practice, becoming aware of the water that we swim in. So it's quite an inspirational little piece that I wanted to share with you. So I'll stop sharing my slides, pick up what's going on in the chat. Yes, we can't send slices, okay, to everyone. Sorry, I wish I could. Changing the conversation with commissioners and with frontline staff and engaging in more conversations. Oh, well, you're storming. Yes, absolutely. All these things can happen. It's about just starting a different conversation, isn't it? That's so lovely. Thank you. Nick, you've got a hand up. Is it a historical hand up from earlier, or would you like to come in?
Oh, sorry, why did I put my hand up? Sorry, I've got
Oh,
short
that's
term.
all right. No, it might have been from earlier, and then because I
All
shared
right,
slides in
okay.
the meantime, I wasn't sure if you'd like put your hand down and put your hand back up. So don't
All right,
worry, that's absolutely fine.
no problems.
Anybody else? Any other thoughts or any other questions? If I take 2 minutes to gather thoughts and questions, and I'll hand back promptly to Pete and Ollie. I can see a few people typing. I'll give you a minute to finish your writing. Okay, we seem to have come to a natural pause. So if there's, oh no, Eve's stuff's just coming. I'll just pick up Eve's comment and then I'll hand over. Conversations with local charities we support, who support themselves, individuals experiencing homelessness, about organizational priorities and moving forward. Oh yeah, funding. Funding is such a tricky context to be operating in within, because it's just goes so counter the kind of relational power equalizing work. Like the kind of the charity funding model is just by definition cascading pressures and the opposite of, you know, equalizing power. Is very, very tricky. But having the conversations about people directly about they think priorities are just, yeah, it's great. So it's really good. Just more voices we can bring into a conversation, the more insights we all gain. Yes, politicians, local councillors, etc. Some of them are just so, you know, they're so there. There are some lovely village council, town and community councils who just have these systems to like hear everybody's voice and bring everybody along. And then there are some who's like, I have the power and I like it. So yes, a big cultural shift needed in lots of different places. I can yes, I can pick up any specific questions or anything after the break, but for now I will stop waffling on and hand over back to Pete and Ollie. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts. Back to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Noreen. Really appreciate that. I've learned loads. That was great. So thank you very much. What I'm going to suggest is, because I'm desperate for coffee, and that's no reflection on you, Noreen. It's just I'm desperate for coffee all the time. If we take 10 minutes, so if we come back at 10 to 11, and then we'll just take the next half an hour to do a bit of reflection. I'll take us through. There'll be more opportunities to ask questions to Noreen. Perhaps anything that comes out whilst you're making yourself a coffee or tea or glass of water, then perhaps we can then take that next half an hour from 10 to 11 to do that, if that's okay. And then at the very end, I'll just share what's happening in the next session, which we've got in scheduled for September, and some other stuff that we can just briefly tell you about. But if we all come back at 10 to 11, we shall see you then. Thank you very much.